Alrighty, everybody. Welcome to the Milky Way editing stream. Hope you're all doing well. There's a little bit of a lag between when I say something and when you guys actually hear it, but I do have a semi bit of low latency going, hopefully. So, if any questions or comments pop up in the chat, I have that open over here to my left, and I can see that pretty quickly and easily if you have anything that you do need to say. But otherwise, I'm just going to kind of do my thing. So, last weekend I led two different workshops in Mount Rainier out here in Washington. And part of that workshop is showing how to edit some of the photos that we took. Editing photos is honestly half, if not more than half, the battle. Well, I don't know about battle, but process of photography. And so it's a really important thing to cover and kind of get down. So I definitely wanted to show my process for doing that. So there's going to be three main things that I'm going to cover in here. And by the way, let me add a quick preface. If at any time like you can't hear me very well, or you hear like some feedback or weird background sound, it is pretty warm in my apartment, and I do have two fans blowing on me actually. So if you can hear those at all, just let me know down in the chat, and I'll try to fix that so it's not as bothersome. But hopefully that's not the case. So what I'm going to be showing off today is three different things. One, how to edit, or how I would edit just a single photograph of the Milky Way, not doing any stacking or composites or anything like that. Just a straightforward edit. So that's going to be, zoom in here, it's going to be these two photos down here at the bottom, okay? Then I'm going to show how to do composite images. So that's where we take one photo that was taken like at twilight or at blue hour, and then combine that with a normal photo of the sky. So I have two different examples of that. This is a really good way to maximize your overall quality in these images, and it's just a good practice if you have the time to do it. So I'm going to show off how I do that. And then lastly, and I might do this in conjunction with the blue hour, I'm going to show how I stack multiple images, how I combine these 14 photos into a single photo with a lot more info and a lot less grain, just better quality, basically. So that's going to be really what we're doing here. So if you want to follow along at all, or if you want to know the various programs that I'm going to be using, this is what they are. So I'm not really using it today, but since I've already used it once when importing all these photos, but a big part of my workflow is Adobe Bridge. Super helpful program. It's like your file explorer, whether you're on Mac or PC, but a lot more adapted for photos, and it works really well in the whole Adobe suite. So I use that all the time. For actually editing, I'm going to be using Adobe Lightroom Classic. You can use regular Lightroom CC, but I just find it's a little less functional, and you can't really use it as well with Photoshop as you can Lightroom Classic. So that's the one I'm using here. And then I'm also going to be using Adobe Photoshop along with that. Within Photoshop, I'll go ahead and show you this now. If I just make a new file real quick to show you. I use two different plugins inside of Photoshop. One of them is Lumenzia, which is by Greg Benz, and the other is the Pro Panel by John Weatherby. Both have very similar functionality, and if I was recommending one to a beginner, I would probably say go with the Pro Panel. It's just not the one that I started with, and so I still go to Lumenzia. I still understand it better for the functionality that I get out of it, but for Astro and Milky Way stuff specifically, this is really nice because it has a dedicated panel of tools for it. So really all these are just faster ways of doing things that I could do on my own, but just much more efficient and just really helpful. So that's really all they are. It's not like they're adding something that doesn't already exist within inside Photoshop. Is it a paid plugin? Yes, they are both paid. I wonder, let me see here. The Pro Panel is, Neither one is terribly expensive, thankfully. I mean, they are very worth it. All right, so 50 here, and I think it's also 50 for Lumenzia. They're totally, totally worth it. I've used Lumenzia now for a little over 2 years, and the Pro Panel, like almost 2 years. Both super worth it. But yes, there is a payment associated with them. I don't think either one has a trial version. But yeah, definitely worth it. So those are the two things I'm going to be using inside of Photoshop. We got Lightroom, and then the last thing is this application called Starry Landscape Stacker. Now this is specific to Mac. This is only on Mac OS. If you are on a Windows PC and you want a similar application, there is one called Sequitur. I'm going to type it here so you can see it. Sequator. I've never used it personally, but I know folks that have, and I've compared it to Starry Landscape Stacker. Very similar functionality, very similar results. It's just dependent on which operating system you're on. So this is going to be the third thing that I'm using for stacking those images later. And I think that's really going to cover it. I'm not going to do any star trails or anything like that today. So yeah, that should be it. I don't see any other questions in the chat at the moment, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to go standard photo first, then I'll do the blue hour composite, and then I'll do the stack. Actually, we'll do stack and then blue hour composite, because I'm thinking of throwing the stack in there with those. So I have two photos here, pretty much the same time of night. One is just vertical and one is horizontal. This is the total raw image. I haven't done anything to this yet. So let's go ahead and walk through what I would do for this photo. I haven't edited these before, so like I don't have a roadmap in mind. I'm just kind of going at it as I go at it. So I always start by going down to sharpening, lens corrections, and sometimes vignetting depending on the photo. In some cases I'll turn this on, in some cases I won't. On this one, you're seeing how it's going to pull out those sides, and it's going to eliminate the distortion that's present within this 17mm lens. I was using a Tamron here, 17 to 28mm. So it's going to pull that distortion out. I kind of like the way that looks. I always turn on remove chromatic aberration, and then I don't touch anything else. When it comes to sharpening, you got to be really careful with the stars because you can quickly sharpen too much. So if we zoom in here, I'm going to turn sharpening up to 100, and you can see the stars got sharper, but so did the grain. We don't necessarily want that. So what you can do is on this masking slider, hold down Option, or maybe it's Control on Windows, and as you drag that to the right, you're going to see it get a lot more black, and only specific things are highlighted in white. These are the things that are actually going to be sharpened, so I'm going to leave it generally at about the same place as the actual sharpening slider itself. Bring up detail a little bit, drop radius a little bit. It's just overall the way that I like to do it. And so you can see, hopefully you can see on YouTube, that was before, and that's now. Just adding a little bit of sharpness just to the really bright stars and not the grain itself. Now because there is a lot of grain in here, I'm going to utilize the luminance slider. This is just straight up a denoise tool. Now it can be pushed too far. If I take it way too far, you can see it gets way too soft. It's no longer realistic, right? So for Milky Way stuff, I like to hover between 10 and 20. I think like 18 is a healthy amount for here. There's no like right way to do it. It's all just based on how it looks to you. So once I'm done there, I'll go back up to the top and I'll start working my way down the list. So initially when I look at this photo, I think, okay, it's a little bit too dark. Like there's not enough happening in the really dark areas, and there's not enough brightness popping up here. So I'm going to start by raising the shadows a little bit, recover a little of that info. I want to be careful though, because one, we have these lights from, I think these were headlights probably causing these. And then we also have somebody's red headlamp kind of flooding this field in front of us here. So I don't want to pull it too far, the shadows, because I don't want to start accentuating those details that aren't, wanted. But I do want a little bit. So maybe drag that back down. Highlights, honestly, we already have all of our highlight info. I could bring it down a little, but I don't think I need to. There's nothing I need to reduce here. We're already pretty dark. So I'm not going to touch that one a whole lot. In the field, I wish I had made this a little bit brighter. This is shot at 10,000 ISO. I sometimes will go to 16,000 to make it brighter, but in this case I just didn't. So if I did go brighter, that would be a case in which I would want to then probably reduce those highlights a little further, but not this time. Whites and blacks, the one thing you can really look at is your histogram up here to see if you need to adjust those. If these triangles are illuminated with some kind of color, that means you're clipping in that area. When what clipping means is you are losing information in those areas. So if this left arrow has something in it, if it has white or some color, that means the dark areas or the blacks are being clipped. And if this had something in it, that means the whites are being clipped. It's dark, no whites are being clipped, but we are losing some black information. So very similar to that masking slider. I'm going to hold down Option on my Mac while I drag this. And you're going to see as I move this, different areas are being shown. So this is showing where black information is being lost. So I'm going to bring that up until there's not a lot being lost. You can see there's a little jump right there. I don't think we're going to make much headway by bringing it past that point. So I think right there is a healthy place to bring it to. And then because we're not clipping on the whites, I'm actually going to increase them, add a little more white to the photo, which is going to start to help our overall contrast, right? And then we'll leave that for right now. This is a place where I always come back to and kind of adjust as I need to. I do want it to be slightly warmer, not too much. So right now I'm at 4750 Kelvin. Bring that up to like 4900. Just add a little bit of warmth back in there. Now down here in presence, you can really go overboard quite quickly. It's a beginner mistake, in my opinion, to really drag up your clarity slider. At the time, it feels like it's doing a really good job. Overall, though, it's just removing contrast, or it's removing saturation and adding contrast in all the wrong places. So I almost never bring that up. In fact, I've started to bring it down a lot, around like negative 10 to 15. Texture, though, I do like to bring up a bit. It just adds some more star definition to the sky, I've noticed. And then dehaze is a very useful tool, but you can take it too far very quickly. So if I bring it up a little, it's like, wow, okay, we just got a lot more definition in the sky. But you take it too far, and it's like, okay, we've started to go a little outlandish here. So I'm going to bring that back. I think 41's too far. I'm going to make that like 30. And again, if I need to pause and answer any questions about what's going on, do leave it in the chat at any time. I'm looking at it every minute or so. So if you have anything, just let me know. So I think that's good for the basic panel. I'm going to go down now to the tone curve. Now this is a really good area to begin adding contrast. This first slider is super helpful because it adds contrast, but it's really not overpowering. I want you to look right here especially. That's where you're going to see this biggest difference as I move this. So this is where we were at, and that's me bringing it up. It's so subtle, but it is quite nice. So I'm going to bring that to about 70. And this next slider, the lights, that is a little bit more power. As I start bringing that up, you can see a much larger effect, right? So I don't want to take that too far. Maybe leave it right about there. Ish. And again, I'll come back to these often and tweak as I need to. Now our darks are already pretty dark. I don't want to take these too far. Usually on the darks, I will almost always raise this up and then bring this down just a little bit just to keep contrast. So I'm liking how that's looking so far. I definitely see some things that we can work on. If you'll notice, if you look back up at the histogram, now I am clipping in both areas. I have started to begin to clip the highlights. So I can bring down this top slider and it will stop clipping, but I don't think that's the culprit. I think this was probably. So you can see they're clipping right there. But it's probably just because stars are really, really bright, and so it's natural to see some clipping in astrophotos. Unless your actual core of the Milky Way is clipping, you should be fine. So the biggest thing right now that I'm noticing is, one, I think I brought the shadows too high, and I really want to add some vignette. I do not like how bright these corners are. I want to move focus to the center of the image here. This is not what I want the viewer to be focusing on, right? And vignette's the best way to do that. So I'm going to go back down here, and vignette is down in effects. Now, sometimes for Astro, I'm okay doing vignette in Lightroom. Other times, I prefer to do it inside of Photoshop, especially just for standard landscape photos. But in this case, I'm fine doing it here. So I'm gonna grab some vignette, and let's go like -20. I think -24 was too far. So we'll bring it right there, and I think that made a good effect. Now we have a lot more focus on the middle and not as much on the edges, which is what we want, right? We want the viewer to focus on the mountain. We want them to focus on the Milky Way. Those are what's important. So because I added that vignette, it kind of helped my shadow issue a little bit, and it's honestly not bothering me too much anymore. I do want to add a little bit of color here, so I'm just going to increase vibrance a little bit, not far, because I don't want to make too many global adjustments. And what global adjustments means is like adjustments that affects the whole photo. As much as you can, you want to affect just specific areas in the photo. So one way you can do that is with this HSL panel. It's where you can target specific colors to affect their brightness or saturation, or even kind of change their overall tone. Very, very helpful here. So what I'm going to do is I want to raise the saturation on the core. And you can see it's kind of an orangish hue. So I could just drag up the orange slider and it will affect that, but it's not as accurate as it could be. So what I'm going to do is get this little dot here and hover over that part, click, and then drag it from there. You'll notice on the right, it's pulling both orange and yellow at a proportional rate. So I'm going to bring that up a little bit, maybe a little more. I feel like with Milky Way photos, you can really punch it, and it generally will look okay. I'm going to bring luminance up just a little bit too. Just a little bit. Just to make that area a little bit brighter. And so at this point, I usually like to sit back and think, okay, what do we like? What do we not like? I like to look at the before and the after and see where we're at. And that is a good difference so far. Like in most cases, I'd be fairly happy with this. But I know there's some more work that we can do, right? One thing I'm automatically noticing is there's just a little bit too much happening on the left. Like all the interest is here, so a little bit of stuff here and a lot more stuff here. So I'm actually going to crop from the bottom left corner. I want to eliminate some of the left side, and there's not a lot happening on the ground, so I can eliminate there too. So I'm going to bring it up to about here. And I think that looks a lot better. So at this point, I'm thinking we're looking pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and bring this into, actually, I'm going to bring it into Photoshop, but before I do, I'm going to copy all these edits. I'm going to apply them over here because this is pretty much the same time of night. All the same edits will apply. Just want to go ahead and get that kind of edited. Also notice this one needs to be tilted a little bit. There we go. Bring that in. Cool. I think that's looking pretty good when and if we want to come back to that. But I think the majority of our work is going to be on this this initial one. So let's bring this into Photoshop, and I will show you what I do over here. Okay. So I right-click in Lightroom, edit in Adobe Photoshop 2022, and now that is where we are. So the photo just opened as a TIFF file, or when we save it, it will be saved as a TIFF. So it will not be the original RAW file, but still a lot of info in there, and that's why I do all the edits in Lightroom first and then bring it in here. So immediately what I'm thinking is, okay, I don't want to, accentuate the dark areas, but I also don't want it to just be pitch black down here. I want a little bit of interest. So the way I can do that is going to be with Lumenzia. So without giving a full rundown as to how this works, I will try to make it brief. Lumenzia and ProPanel both give you access to what are called luminosity masks. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, in Photoshop you have layers and you have layer masks. That's basically like the building blocks of how Photoshop works. So over here on the right you'll see both of those. This is the original layer and this is the layer mask. On masks, the more white the mask, the more shown that image is. The more black it is, the more concealed it is. And masks can kind of be drawn on too. So you'll notice right here, the mask is entirely white right now, right? But if I were to get a larger black brush and just start drawing, it's like I'm erasing it, because now, because now on my mask, that's where I just drew in black, okay? So obviously we don't want to do that. So the way Lumensity and ProPanel work with luminosity masks is they create those, but they make them super, super targeted to specific areas of the photo. You know, some areas of the photo will be totally white, some will be totally black, some will be certain shades of gray, and if it's gray, that means it's kind of affecting the layer that it's on. So they make them really, really accurate. The way I'm going to use them right now is I'm going to target the darkest parts of this image and make them just a little bit brighter. Not enough to accentuate it, but enough to not make it totally, totally black. And actually, you know what? Before I do that, let's get rid of these lights over here. Easiest way I can think to do it is just to Photoshop them out, really. So I'm just going to select them here with the lasso tool. Just kind of free draw around them. And then I'm also going to hold shift and draw around this one too, so I can select both at the same time. Cool, so now we have those two selections. Now you're going to go to Edit, Content Aware Fill. And Photoshop will do its best to fill in those areas intelligently to where it looks natural. And it will give you a preview over here on the right. I think that looks pretty good. I'm going to hit OK. I have it to where it automatically applies to that same layer. By default, it will create a new layer with those adjustments. But boom, there we go. Didn't even know that they were there. And then I'm actually going to leave in this little bit of red. It just adds a little bit of definition to the ground. Might as well keep it in. It'd just be kind of a hassle to take it out. You know, I don't think it would have that big of an effect. So we're going to go into Lumensity here. I'm going to hit D for darks, and it's going to pull up a preview of a mask, okay? This is where you see in white, that's the area the mask is selecting. The more white it is, the more it's being selected. And down here in these really dark gray to black areas are the places where it's not being selected. So because I'm targeting the really dark darks, you're going to notice all the stars are black. Stars obviously are not dark, therefore they're not going to be targeted, right? But down here in the foreground, it's almost completely white because it's almost completely black in a normal photo. So this is selecting too much for my opinion. I don't want to target all of this. I'm going to drag this down, and as I drag it down, it gets a lot more specific with its targeting. So I'm actually going to bring it down to like a 6.5 or maybe a 6. What I'm trying to do is avoid too much selection in the sky itself. I'm really just looking at the foreground here. So I think I'm going to bring it a little further, and then I'm going to use this levels adjustment just to bring up that area. And so now, this is our new mask. All the areas in white down here, this is what's going to be selected with that mask. I'm going to go right here and grab a brightness contrast layer. And so now, you'll notice nothing changed, but now I have a brightness contrast layer, which is basically like a single Lightroom slider, but as a layer. And then I have that mask applied to it. So whatever changes I make on this adjustment by raising, lowering, adding, subtracting contrast and brightness will only affect the areas in white and gray, and it will affect them based on how white they are. Hopefully that makes sense. And if there's any questions about this, again, leave them in the chat. So I'm going to select that. I'm going to bring my brightness up a little bit. So you'll notice, let's actually zoom in down here. You'll see what's happening. It's just raising the brightness on these darkest areas. Now, granted, they're super grainy. I really don't want to accentuate them too much, but there's info to be had here. You know what I mean? So I'm going to raise those up a little bit, and then I'm going to add just a little bit of contrast back, because by me raising those darks, I'm eliminating contrast. So I'm going to raise that back up to kind of introduce some back in. So it's a really subtle change, but overall it does help the feel of the photo in my opinion, because it's not the focus, but we also don't want it to be an extreme, or you don't want it to detract at all from what you're trying to show the viewer. So that looks pretty good. Now, if you noticed when I zoomed in there, there were some really, really bright dots. So these right here are an example of what are called hot pixels. With astrophotography, it's super, super hard to avoid. You can turn on noise reduction in the camera, which I had almost all my students do, and it will help eliminate a lot of these. Like, had I not had that turned on, there would be 100 times more of them, but they still do pop up. Easiest way to get rid of them is just with a spot healing brush tool in Photoshop or spot removal in Lightroom. I'm just going to click over those real quick, get rid of some of those dots. Just in case someone does zoom in, I don't want those to be any kind of distraction, you know. I don't want it to look like there are stars in the foreground. Find the couple ones that really stand out prominently. And I think that looks pretty good. And that's a hiker right there. That's not a star or a hot pixel, so we will not worry about it. All right. So now that we're in here, what I'm thinking we need to do is brighten up the core, really accentuate it, add a lot of contrast in here, and then darken these areas slightly, just to pull as much focus into this area as possible, okay? So let's start by just raising brightness in the Milky Way. Again, I'm going to use these, actually, you know what? I haven't used Pro Panel for this purpose in a while. Let's see if I still can. So I want to do probably a lights mask, or let's try a midtones mask. So as I click through these various values on the midtones mask, you're going to see more and more gets selected. I don't want too much. I'm just going to use lumens. Yeah, I don't feel like troubleshooting and figuring that application out on the fly. So I'm going to do a midtones mask here. So it's going to pull, in this case, the info that's not too dark but not too bright. It's going to pull the most neutral info and affect that the most. And the core of the Milky Way is a very neutral tone. It's not too dark, not too bright. So that's what it's going to affect here. Now, what I'm going to do instead of just making an individual brightness contrast layer, I'm going to make a new layer, just a blank one. I'm going to hit it with soft light instead of normal. And then I'm going to apply this as a, oops, actually did not mean to do that. I'm going to hit that again. Instead of hitting mask, I'm going to hit selection, because I'd rather brush in all of this info instead of just using a slider to bring it up. So I have this layer here. It's totally blank. There's nothing on it right now. But I'm going to get my brush, and what I'm going to do, so if you remember that mask that we just saw, that's what was being selected. I could show you, if I really zoom in here, you can see the marching ants. This shows what's being affected, like it targets pixel by pixel. I just don't think that seeing the ants at that scale really helps, so I turned it off. But again, it's only going to affect the really bright areas of that mask. So to get this brush, I'm going to come in here, select the same tone as the core, make it as bright as possible, desaturate a bit, because I'm really just going to be adding brightness here, but I still want it to be of similar tonality to the core itself. So now that I have that color selected, up here at the top with your brush controls, I usually leave opacity at 100, but I'm going to bring my flow down to like 3%. Now what flow does is, what's the best way to explain this? It's like if you were painting and you had a very weak brush and you had to go over something multiple times for that color to really stick. It's because it has a low flow, okay? So I don't want it to be 100% where I just make one pass and all of a sudden, boom, it's applied super heavily. I want to be able to go back and forth on certain areas to add more of this stuff or less of it as I want to. Just allows me to be a little more accurate and selective. So 3% flow, same color there. And my brush, I want it to be really soft because I just don't want any hard lines here. I really don't want hard delineation between colors and tones. So now that we have that, I'm just going to lightly start drawing in here on the core. And it doesn't look like much when you're first doing it, but then when you turn this layer on and off, you really start to see a big difference in how it's affecting stuff. So I'm going to really focus on that area right there. I'm actually going to hit eraser real quick because I think I went a little too far. Again, flow down pretty low. Gonna eliminate some stuff on the edge here. I feel like I made too hard of a line on that edge. Back to brush. So just right there, you can see we added a lot. Now when I click it on and off, it looks kind of synthetic, but once you don't see it that way, it absolutely still looks natural. And so I think that's pretty good. I'm okay. I'm happy leaving that there. Now I still have this selection made. Like, it's still active based on the fact that this is green. So what I'd like to do now is make a brightness contrast layer. And when I do that with an active selection, it automatically makes that layer with that mask. I do think that this is going to be affecting too much. So two ways of going about this. You could, one, just straight brush black onto here and get rid of those areas it's going to be affecting. I don't think that's a good idea or the best idea. What you should do instead is make a group, put that layer in the group, and then layer the group. So now I can be really selective with where this is and isn't letting this pass through. Hopefully that makes sense. So I'm going to make that layer totally black. And now I'm going to brush with white all through here, letting that brightness come back in. Okay, so what this is allowing me to do now is when I select this brightness contrast layer, it's going to be affecting this mask, but only in this area. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. So once we click that, I start raising the brightness and contrast, you can see where it's being affected. So I'm just going to bring the brightness up slightly, but really focuses on contrast. So you can see what that did right there. So within just a couple of layers, we've already added a lot more interest into that Milky Way and brought up a little information in our foreground, which is nice. My overall philosophy is just keep things as natural as possible. You can totally edit differently, but that's just the way that I like to go about things. So I want to make sure, because you know our eyes, we see really dark and we see really bright at the same time very well. So I want a photo that does, you know, a pretty similar job. You know, sitting here for a sec, I think this is a little too much. I'm going to bring that opacity down a little bit just to lessen that effect that it's having. Cool. So one tool that ProPanel has that I think is really good, see over here in effects, is this reduce stars. So there's obviously a lot of stuff happening here. And when you zoom out, it can look kind of messy. So what this does, I'm going to select it here, hit reduce stars, give it a second to process. Basically what it's doing is just darkening the smaller photos. So you can see by turning it on and off here, it really just eliminates all those really bright specks. It just leaves what's most important, the core and the really bright stars. Just kind of helps pull any distractions out. I do think it's a little strong at first, and so I'll often turn that opacity down to like 50. And it's a very minor effect, but overall it just kind of helps soften the sky, you know, because our eyes also, we don't see it that with that much clarity. You know, there's not that much of a delineation between how bright the stars are and how dark the sky is like there is in this photo. So it's just nice to help eliminate and make that a little bit softer. So honestly, at this point, it's looking pretty good. I'm quite happy with it. One thing, I want to continue to darken the sides here. So there's many ways of going about that. I could just straight add a vignette here and kind of color it in specific places. I don't think that's the best option for right now because I don't want a total oval around it. I want to be more specific. So what's the way I want to go about this? Because there's two ways I like to do it. One way you could is just by making it into the brightness contrast layer, or you don't have to do brightness contrast. Levels and curves and exposure, these all have very similar effects. I just prefer brightness and contrast. So I could just straight drag that down, bring this up, and then invert that so we don't see that effect. And so what I could do now is get a really big brush. Okay. Make sure my flow is very low. Probably a 2 or a 3. I'll go 3. Make sure it's soft, 0% hardness. And then as I draw this in, I want to be very wary of not darkening the mountain at all. So what I'm going to do really quick is I'm going to select my original photo. And Photoshop is very good at grabbing specific areas. I'm going to have it just select the sky. So now it's just made a selection of this area. Now when I draw, even if I brush totally over the mountain, it's not in my active selection, so it's not going to be affected. So now that I have that selected, whoops, make sure I'm selected on that layer mask. I got the brush, and I have it set to white because I want to begin revealing this layer. So I'm just going to brush in a little more heavily on the corners and then lighten it up as I get in. And then do the same thing over here real quick. Kind of come in. I want to make sure I darken this a little bit too. I'm going to get a little smaller here. Going to get that top a little bit darker. I'm going to brush over the core just a couple times. Not because I want to make it darker, but I do want to add some of that contrast. So it's still selected. I just want to get rid of those marching ants. So you'll see when I turn this on and off, we just darkened. Actually, I darkened too much is what I did. So I'm going to hit, now since I've gone too far, I'm going to hit X to swap these colors. Now I'm back to black. And know that it's not an AC/DC reference. And I am going to brush this back out. So I am going to do black to conceal that layer and bring some brightness back. I do think I went too far, which can totally happen. This is just a matter of trial and experiment, really. Trial and error, that's the phrase. So now that I've brought that back, I like that a lot more. I'm not affecting the core, but I am affecting these areas. And I could honestly lighten it up just a little bit. May have gone a little too heavy. Cool, made that a little bit darker, drew a little more focus in here. And so at this point, honestly, it's looking pretty good to me. I'm going to go ahead and deselect now. This is not common practice with Milky Way photos, but it is with just standard landscape photography. And I think I'm going to do it here. So what I'm going to do is something called an Orton effect. And what it is basically just making the bright parts of an image glow. Usually uses for sunrises and for sunsets. But since the core is glowing, I do want to use it on here a little bit. Excuse me, I had to take a quick drink. So, the way you do that is Command Option Shift or Control Option Shift plus E if you're on Windows. That's going to create a layer based on all the layers beneath it. So this is our photo in a single layer. Then I'm going to hit Command or Control Shift A, and that's going to open up Adobe Camera Raw. Now, Camera Raw is like Lightroom inside of Photoshop. It has almost all the same functionality as Lightroom, but it's a plugin instead of an actual application. So many folks will just use Photoshop. They'll open a raw file as a layer and then use Camera Raw to edit it instead of Lightroom. I like Lightroom just for its organizational tools, but this is a very, very good one too. So the way you do an Orton effect is basically you add contrast and saturation. Contrast means really bright brights, really dark darks. Saturation just means a lot of color. So exposure is going to come up, contrast is going to come up, highlights up, shadows down, whites up, blacks down, and you do not have to be accurate with this. Texture up, slightly. Clarity up a little bit because it does add contrast, and dehaze a good bit. And saturation and vibrance, we're really going to crank vibrance on this one. Saturation just a little bit. So you can see this photo looks god-awful. Like, I would never actually make this photo because it's just, it's like a unicorn threw up on it, right? But you'll see what we're going to do with it here in a second. And I'm going to make it just a little bit warmer. You'll see why. So once I made those effects, I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. And there it is in all its horrible, horrible glory. So now I'm going to change its blending mode from normal to soft light, so it's not letting everything come through. Then we're going to go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. And you want to set this number of pixels around the same as your camera's resolution, okay? So I have a 24 megapixel camera. I like to set this to 26. If you have a 45 megapixel camera, change this to like 47. You just around your resolution, set that to. We're gonna hit OK. Now I'm going to deselect it, okay? So we're back to the normal photo. And I'm going to hit L for a lights adjustment on Lumenzia. So this is just going to select the brightest parts of the image, which is, in this case, the core and the stars themselves. I do think the core could have a little bit more, though. So I'm going to go to that levels again, bring that up, add a little bit more brightness here so it gets more greatly affected. I'm going to reselect that layer and hit mask. So it's going to apply that mask to the god-awful layer, and I'm going to go ahead and turn that layer off. So this is what we have with the horrible edits, the blur, soft light. And then once I enable this mask, you'll see, okay, we're back to kind of our normal photo, but there's a lot more glow happening. Adds a lot of feel to an image. Often I think Gaussian or Orton effects are a little strong. Bring that back to like 60 or 70. But you'll see it's a very subtle effect, but it does help a lot. It smooths things out without making them look soft, if that makes sense. Maybe make this a little bigger because I realize I may not be looking at this as bigly as I am, as largely as I am. And so, yeah, that's an Orton effect. So honestly, at this point, that's pretty much where I'd stop. I could go in and make it a little bit brighter in the dark areas, but overall, I am pretty happy with this. So one thing I will sometimes do is, if I remember where it is, over here in Pro Panel, I'll hit Smart Sharp. It just sharpens stuff more intelligently. It's very strong though, so I have to dial that back, but it does have kind of a nice effect. And so from start to finish, this is what we brought into Photoshop, and that's what we're getting out of it. Still maintaining a lot of that natural look, but accentuating the core, adding a lot more interest to the sky, pulling interest away from the areas that we don't want it to be in. And so that's it. So I'm gonna go ahead and close this, and it's gonna ask me if I want to save it. Absolutely, I want to save that. And when you do this in and out of Lightroom, you will see here in a second, once it finishes saving, because it's a bit of a bigger file. Once I come back in here to Lightroom, this is the original photo, and then it saved the new photo as a TIFF. So it created the new file for us. And so if you wanted to go back into Photoshop, you can hit this TIFF, edit in Adobe Photoshop, and edit original, and all of those layers that we just made would be there. And so that's how I would do just a standard Milky Way shot. So we'll, let me show you something real quick. Yeah, I got it. So that's the photo we just made. So this is before and after. Let me collapse these in. So on the right, that's our before. That was the raw image, and then on the left is our final edit. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm gonna take like 20 seconds here, ask the chat, how are we doing? How's it looking? Are there any questions about what I just did? If not, just give me a quick thumbs up or we're good, and I'll move on. I'm gonna take a quick drink here while we update to that. It looks good, bit complicated. We'll have to review this again. Is there anything specifically I can help you with, or is it just kind of a lot of stuff happening at once, and it's just a lot of info to take in? Which one is it? Because if it's something specific, I'm more than happy to go back and retouch it real quick or go over it again. Just let me know. Just a lot of info. Okay, totally hear you. Yeah, thankfully this will never use the layers, so we'll have to play around. Yeah, when I first started messing with Photoshop, it was conceptually very difficult, but I will say tools like Lumencia and the Pro Panel are, I think, the best ways to start figuring it out. I would recommend the Pro Panel between the two because they have very similar functionality, but Pro Panel adds some extra tools, and I think it's a little bit cleaner of a process. But Lumencia is great too. I think they're just really good tools to learn how Photoshop works. And honestly, it's just practice. It's the best way to learn how that application works. But thankfully, this live stream should be saved as just a standard video on my channel once we're all done, so you can totally go back through and rewatch it. It should be set up to work that way. I don't think... Yeah, I'm looking at my settings here, and I should have that enabled. So cool. All right. So what I want to do now is show you how I do a stack. Now, I'm not going to be editing the photo like I just did because the edits would apply either way. But I am going to show you how we do a stack. So these are all raw files straight out of camera. Okay, so you'll see this is the first one. As I start going through them, there is very little movement up in the sky. So each one of these was 10 seconds long, and there was about a second in between each one. So it's definitely going to be moving as time goes on. So if we zoom in here, hopefully you'll be able to tell. You'll see the stars moving, and you can see the grain moving, but the grain changes, okay? The stars obviously don't change. The stars are stars. They're actual things. Grain is just stuff created by the camera. So what this application is going to do is it's going to find the parts of the image that are the same, that like aren't changing or are moving together. In this case, that being the stars themselves. And it's going to remove or reduce the things that are not consistent. That's the grain. The grain changes from photo to photo, right? So that's what's really cool about it. So Starry Landscape Stacker has two options. Thankfully, they have added support now for raw files, so you can import raw files straight into it. You don't have to edit and export a certain kind of file. With that being said, the file you then get from it is a TIFF. You know, so there's three big types of files in photography. There's a raw file, which is what you want to take out of camera and what you want to be editing with. There's a JPEG, which is your final photo that you will put on your phone, share on Instagram. And then there's a TIFF. So like that photo that we just made over here, this is a TIFF. It's a usable photo in that you can share it and post it usually, but it just contains a lot more information than a JPEG does. It's just not as good as a raw file. So with Starry Landscape Stacker and Sequitur, they both export TIFF files, so I could still absolutely edit with it, and I can still get very similar results to what I just did, but I prefer to edit actual raw files. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the edits that we made on... I'm going to bring this back in, lower those presets. I'm going to copy the edits that we made on this original photo, okay? I'm going to come back out here to the stack, and I'm going to apply the edits over here. So it's a lot of the same stuff, so I don't really need to worry about editing it all the same way again. Then I'm going to select all of these, make sure this is turned up and auto sync is on, paste those across the board so that all 14 images have very similar looks. So what I would prefer to do is export all of these as TIFFs and then bring that into Starry Landscape Stacker. So I bring TIFFs in, get a TIFF out, but that way most of the editing is already done, you know? So we're gonna go ahead and select all of these, hit export. I'm going to choose a folder. We'll just come in here. I was doing some wedding editing before the stream. Rainier Workshops, and then we're just gonna add a new folder called Stream TIFFs. I'm gonna have it go there. And then I have it set to just edit a specific way. I'm really not worried about the naming right here. I do want to make sure, actually, so we're going to go file name. I'm going to add a sequence here. see, I want to have multiple files, so I'm going to get rid of that guy. So this way, it's going to make a sequence out of it. Star Landscape Stacker works best if you have a set sequence. So if your first photo is 1 or 14, and then your last photo is 28 or something, as long as they're sequenced accurately, it works a lot better in that application. So just make sure of that. So I'm going to have all of these sequenced with these last 2 digits. And actually, I kind of messed that up. Let's come back in here, edit. We're going to do stream TIFF, then sequence. We're going to do it that way. Okay. Got the naming down. Can I please share how I got it again? Absolutely. Yeah, let's go back. So when I was in develop over in solo shots, this is that photo that we just edited, right? I just hit Control C, just like you're copying something in a Word document. I hit Control C and it brings up copy settings. And then you select the things that you want it to copy over. So I don't want to copy any cropping that I did. I don't want to do any spot removals or masking because those are specific to each photo. But I do want it to get all of the way I adjusted light, all the way I adjusted color, the way I did distortion control, sharpening, stuff like that. I want it to copy all the stuff from this edit. So once I do that, I just hit copy, right? Then we go over to stack 1. I'm going to hold shift. I'm on photo 1 here, holding shift, click on 14. Now I have 14 of 14 selected, right? By default, this little box down here is turned off. Just flick that up, make sure that says auto sync. Whoops. Click that up, hit auto, make sure it says auto sync, and then you're good to go. Then you're going to hit Command V or Control V, like you're pasting in a Word doc, and it's going to put those edits on every single photo. So those settings you just copied, it's going to apply those all over here. So if I scroll down, you'll see that same sharpening that we did is down here, same vignetting, all of that is now on the same photo. Does that answer that question? I'm looking at the chat hoping you respond to that. All right, awesome. So back in the library, Control or Command A, select all of them, export. So we got that. Let's read this naming real quick. So stream TIFF. I'm going to sequence it. Cool. Actually, I want to add a dash in there. Dash, there we go. Okay. Got that naming down. Then in file settings, turn off sharpening. Image format, we're going to go TIFF. And then compression, none. Adobe RGB, this is what you should be shooting in on your camera. And then bit depth, 16 bits. So I'm just telling it basically put as much info as possible into this TIFF file. And so once I have that, I have this folder selected. I'm going to go ahead and hit export. It's going to export these TIFFs. Now these are larger files. This is not going to be the fastest process, especially if your computer's a little bit slower. But just give it a sec. It should be fast enough. Thankfully, I got a new laptop the other day, and so it's going a lot faster than my other computer would have. Cool. So that little ding, which I guess you can't hear, but there was a little ding. It's exported. It's gone away. Cool. So now I have those 14 TIFFs. So I'm going to click on Starry Landscape Stacker here, and it's going to ask me to pull up or select the files I want to stack. So I could go in here to raw, and I think it was 39 through 50 or something, I think is what it was, or 38 through 50. So I could just come in here and select the raws and it would do the same thing. But since we did these TIFFs and I want these edits, I'm going to go ahead and select all of these. So go ahead and select all of them and then hit open. So it's going to look at all of the images. It's going to see what's similar, what's not. Then it's going to find the middle image of all of them. And it's going to bring the... What's the best way of saying this? So, I have 14 photos. It's going to find photo 7 or 8. It's going to bring photos 1 through 6 to that one. And then it's going to bring photos like 9 through 14 onto that one. It's going to stack every image on the middle one just because everything's moving, right? So this is showing you where it thinks the sky is. This is a chance for you to tell it, hey, you're correct, or hey, you're not right, by drawing in or erasing dots. Say I'm going to draw a couple more dots up here in these blank areas because we do want all of this to be selected. And we have a chance to fix this in the next step, but just another step to take. So I'll leave that for the sky. But you'll notice on Rainier, it thinks that hiker's headlight or headlamp is a star, and that's not the case. So I'm going to hit erase and get rid of that dot right there because we only want to be working with the actual sky. We don't want any dots or stacking to happen on the mountain itself, right? So it looks pretty good. I'm going to hit find sky, and it's going to guess now where the sky is. So everywhere that is a deep blue is what it's going to be stacking, and everything that isn't, which is the mountain, which is good, it won't be. It missed a little bit up here in the top edge, so I'm just going to draw that in really quick. And now it looks pretty good. If you were trying to do this with, like, you see this tree here, if you were a lot closer to a tree and you could see some stars through it, it would get a lot more challenging to do this accurately. Thankfully, this is a very clean horizon line, and it can select it very accurately. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Align and Composite. It's going to bring everything from the left to the middle, everything from the right to the middle, and then boom. So at first, it doesn't look like much happened, right? But if we zoom in here, you can see there is very little grain, which is really nice. This is a great way of getting more quality out of your image. And so I think usually there's a way to show it like before and after. I thought maybe there isn't, or maybe they took that out. I think that's a good way. So this is what we were looking at originally. This is all the grain, right? And then that's with it stacked. You can see just how much it retains and how nice this is. And it was really a simple process, right? So I'm going to bring that back. Composite image. Looks good to me. So now save current image. I'm going to save it in the same area. Their naming conventions are just god awful. So stream, TIFF, stack 1. I'm going to hit save. And then, oh, okay. We'll just, I meant to deselect this thing right here. You usually don't want to do that. I just haven't done this before on this computer. And then we'll do just mask. Okay. So cool. Now we have both of those TIFFs, or really just that one TIFF, and we can now bring that back into Photoshop. So I'm going to hit import, or actually, this is where bridge comes in handy. I don't like to do import. So we were here, going here, stream TIFFs. Let's see, that's, it gives you that same photo, but without the foreground. It just does the part that it actually stacked. You can use that if you want to. I'm just going to do it this way. For the sake of education, we'll go ahead and drag both in. So I select those, bring them into Lightroom. There's many ways to import into Lightroom. That's just my preferred way of doing it. Okay. So cool. This is now our stacked Milky Way. And so what we can do real quick is, let's see, stack 1. Let's go to all of them actually. So we want that guy there. Gosh, what is the way that you do this? Oh, I thought there was a way I could select 2 of them and show you side by side. Oh well, I will not worry about that. I digress. Okay, so that is our stacked TIFF. Going to mark that with green so we know which one it is. And you can see we have a lot of good info there. Cool, so that's how you stack an image. And then from here, you can put this into Photoshop and do a lot of the same edits that we did on this guy if you wanted to. It's really up to you. But now you have just a much cleaner photo to work with. So last thing I want to show you now is how you do a blue hour composite. So for those of you that were my students, you will remember that I had you take a really long blue photo just before it was nighttime. This is the reason that we did that. So you'll see here, actually I think this was the better one. This is the one I did on my second night. So you'll see here I shot this at 30 seconds at f8 ISO 100. This is the cleanest way to get a photo. ISO 100 is often the cleanest ISO for a camera. F8 is usually the sharpest aperture on a lens, and then 30 seconds is just so I can let as much light in as possible. And you'll notice if I bring this into the develop area, because I shot it at ISO 100, I have a lot of info sitting in these shadows. So if I begin to bring this up, I mean, there's our whole foreground right there, right? And I can make this even brighter, and it's there. It's a little bit grainy, but it's really pretty good. I don't really want to do that because, again, that's not the focus. I do want to raise the exposure just a little bit, though. So what I'm going to be doing is showing you how I take this photo with this sky and make them look like one seamless image, okay? So firstly, what I'd like to do is just apply that same edit over here onto this photo. So this is just the edit from that initial photo that we did. I again just hit Command V to put that on here. Whoops. Get that to go away. So it doesn't totally apply to this image. There's definitely some stuff I want to do. I want to make it a little brighter. I want to make it a little bit warmer and a lot less magenta. It was very, very magenta. Bring the whites up just a little bit. And I'm only editing here for the sky. The foreground, we're going to be using a different file, so I'm not worried about what effect I'm having on that right now. Just worried about the sky. And honestly, I think that looks halfway decent. So, sky is good. The harder part here is making this and this look natural, because obviously they're not taken at the same time of day. You can see on the mountain here, the lighting looks different. You know, it's a little more contrasty, there's more shadow. So how do you go about doing that? Well, easiest way is going to be by removing contrast, because there is very little contrast happening here. It's all very similar tonality, right? So I'm going to straight up drag that back. And it's also pretty dark. I should not have raised that up. I will raise the blacks up a little bit, though, just to maintain some of that black info. Same sort of edits over here. In fact, we can just go and Control V this. And then take that vibrance away. Gosh, why'd that get so cold? So I think that brings up to like 5,500. Dehaze. Definitely don't want to dehaze right here. But this way I have a lot of that same sharpening as I did on that first image. I'm going to take these back. Don't want any of that contrast. But this way I have that sharpening. I have that vignette. And so dehaze, we definitely don't want that. Clarity, we don't like that. We're just trying to make this as blue, flat, and dark as we can while making it still stay pretty natural. Okay. So contrast, going to bring that way down. Exposure, bring that down pretty far too. Okay. And then saturation is also going to come down. Just a little bit. Okay. Make it a little more blue. And this is all stuff that I can fix in Photoshop. So now that I have these two, you know, I have a decent edit on the sky, and I have the foreground pretty similar to how I want it. I'm going to select both of these. Okay. If I go in here, I just have both of these selected. Right click on one, edit in, and then open as layers in Photoshop. And then open anyway. You might get that error message, you might not. So it's going to bring both of these into a new Photoshop file, and they're each going to be their own layer. So you have them both right here. So first step is going to be making sure that they line up with each other, because you'll notice like they're very close, but I must have bumped my tripod before taking these. There is a little difference, right? Very close, but they're a little off. So if I were to straight up start masking and putting it in as it is right now, it would be a little off. So what you can do, shift select both of those. I just come here to help align. Where is it? There it is. Okay. Edit, auto align layers. Just hit that. Leave it on auto. This is only if you were doing very specific photo stitching, but just do auto. Hit OK. It's going to look at both photos and line them up. And you're definitely going to get some wonky edges now if it had to move the photos around. But you'll notice now, if I zoom in on here, It's a little off, but it's basically the same. Right. So now that that's there, what I'm going to do is just get rid of these edges. Easiest way to do that is just by cropping in. So I'm going to come over here, crop in so that none of that's being shown. None of that. And then there's a little bit happening up here. None of that. And so hit OK. Now cool. Now we have 2 stacked files. Whoops. Could have gone a little further. Go right there. Okay. So now we have 2 stacked files that are like right on top of each other, right? And well, I guess there was more work I could have done. A little bit more. Okay, we good now? I think we're good. Okay. So Photoshop is very, very good at what it does in terms of its automatic stuff. In a photo like this, with such a hard delineation between the sky and the foreground, I'm totally comfortable coming in and just doing a select sky. And it's probably going to grab it very accurately. I am noticing, though, that it's grabbing some of the mountain itself. We don't want that. I just want this one line. So maybe we don't want to do that. Maybe we want to do select subject. And, okay, that didn't work either. So we could do select sky and then go back in manually to eliminate the other places that it grabbed. And that's honestly probably what I'm going to do. Now, if you had a really complex sky or there were like trees in the way, it may not work as well. And so, like, one thing that I like to do is utilize these panels again. And I won't do this as a main method. I'm going to use the select sky, but I want to show you just for example's sake. I'm going to make a copy of that layer. I'm going to hit Control-Shift-A again to bring up Camera Raw. I want to make this so blue that it hurts. Exposure way up, and then contrast way, way up. Actually, that's not even going to work as well as I thought. What I was going to try and do is make the sky as blue as possible and then use like a blue luminosity mask. I don't think it's going to work very well, though. So I'm thinking what we want to do is just select sky. So just basically forget everything I just said. All right, so I have that top one selected. I'm going to go down here and select sky. And that's a selection there. Just to see, I'm going to do a selection based on this one. See if the added contrast that we have in the sky makes any difference with how accurate it is. Actually, it does look a little more accurate. So I have the selection made now. I'm going to go back to that first layer. This little button down here, the rectangle with the circle cut out, that's your layer mask. I'm going to hit that, and then you'll see it did the opposite of what I wanted. While I have the mask selected, I'm going to hit Control or Command I and invert that. So now you'll see, okay, we got the foreground from that photo, right? But thanks to this layer mask that we just made, it's masking out the whole sky. It's eliminating the sky and showing what's beneath it. So that's the whole point of masks, right? You have one photo on top of another, and the layer says, okay, I want you to show through to that next layer this much, okay? And so that's what it is doing here. And this honestly looks pretty good. I think the edges worked pretty well. It doesn't look unnatural too much. There is a little bit of distortion up here, but I think that was just the way I took the photo. Not much I can do. And I think we're pretty good there. And so from here, I would just go about my normal editing. Just taking a second to look here. If I did want to continue to make edits to these photos, one thing I could do, I'm going to move this mask onto the group instead and put that layer in the group. Same effect, but this way I'm not doing anything to the layer itself. I'm going to turn this into a smart object, and by turning it into a smart object, it's going to save any changes that I make to it. So like whenever I go in here and I do the camera raw adjustments, normally it makes those adjustments, and then I can't go back and edit them. I would just have to make new adjustments like on top of them. But with the smart object, I can then go back and mess with those same edits again. They're not destructive, as we call them. So what I'm going to do here is make it a little more contrasty. I think I removed too much initially. Shadows up just a little bit. I do like all the info we were getting down there. Say okay. So now it's just a little difference, right? But what's really cool now, and this would be very, very helpful if I had the, in fact, we'll bring it in here. If I had the stack image, you know, the really, really clean image, I think it was right here. Yeah. I'm going to do the one that's actually already masked out. Or actually, no, we're not. We're going to go do this one. If I throw this one into Photoshop too, bring it over here, right? Going to turn that off. I want. I'm just going to make this its own example. Okay, one sec. So that's basically how you do a quick composite image. You bring both in as layers, you align them, and then you use some method to select the sky and mask it out. That's basically the way I do it. I like when I have a really hard line like this, or if it's just like a straight horizon, that's really nice. And Photoshop will do a pretty accurate job for you. So now what I want to show you, the point of doing all the things that I've shown you with the stacking and with this blue hour, I'm going to just eliminate all of these. Don't save, don't worry about it. Is, let's go back here to Lightroom. If I take this, the clean stack, right, and I take this good foreground, select both of those and bring these in as layers. I did not take them at the same time, and so aligning them is going to look a little off. We're going to see how good of a job Photoshop does. Do that. I'm going to do align again. And you'll see how how wonky that ends up looking, but it does line it up. Wow, I've never seen it that extreme before. So we're gonna crop in a whole lot to get a single image out of this. Let's actually come down first. Come into like right there. I don't think it needs to mess with that edge. Let's see here. I do need to bring this in though. It's like right there. So I'm making a very small image here because I did not frame the photos the same way initially. That's why it's so important when you are taking blue hour images to not move your camera afterwards so that you don't have to crop in this much. But I'm going to do the same thing here that we just did, right? So come in here, select, whoops, click that one, select sky. I'm going to do a pretty good job. Come up here. Whoops. All right, let's, what just happened? Okay, come down here, right there. Mask, invert, turn it on. Cool, okay. So now we're gonna see the real advantage of why we do blue hour stacks and we do why we do stacking. I would do composites and overall stacking. Because now our sky, very clean, very little grain happening up here. And our foreground, because we took this at f8 and ISO 100 is also very clean while still looking, you know, pretty natural. There's a lot I could do here with making this look more natural. So I mean, I can totally make this look more similar to the tone of the ground, right? It's a super clean Milky Way photo. That's the reason why we do it, because when you shoot a normal photo at like 10,000 or 12,800 ISO, like you get a lot of grain. There's less editing you can do with it. But if you have a very clean foreground, there's a lot of great editing that you can do there, and often you will not have issues like people's headlamps and headlights if you take something at blue hour. So you can get that foreground then take a sky photo a little bit later and blend the two together to get a much cleaner image. You know, you just got to make sure you match tones between the two as well as possible, and that's a photo to photo basis kind of thing. So yeah, that is really it. Ooh, that's the wrong application. Are there, I'm going to wait about a minute here. Are there any questions that y'all have about everything we did, from editing a photo on its own to how you do stacking, blue hour compositions or composites? If there's any questions, I'm going to take a sip of water here for a sec. Throw them in the chat and let me know. Alrighty, well, I guess there aren't any questions. Hopefully that's a good thing. Oh, hopped on late, but even a little bit I've seen so far makes sense. All right, I'm glad to hear it, man. Glad to hear it. This should be saved as a video after the fact if you want to go back and watch. How long have we been going for? An hour and a half? Holy crap. I did not think it was that long. Yeah, so that's really it for editing the Milky Way. I do want to add a quick shameless plug. I just realized I did not add my microphone to that scene. I don't feel like adding it right now. So I'll just say this here and then I'll add it back. This is my full-time job. I do not have another gig other than this. But if you guys are able to donate or tip anything, I would greatly appreciate that. So I'm going to throw that code back on the screen here in a second. I'm doing this totally for free because I enjoy teaching so much and love this kind of opportunity. So if there is anything that you would like to and can give, I would greatly appreciate that. But if not, that is totally okay. And if there aren't any other questions, I think we will call it there. So I'm going to throw that that Venmo back on here. My microphone will not be active. And I'll leave that up for a few minutes and then we'll call it. So if there's any further questions, I'm going to hang around for another like 5 minutes or so. And just throw them in the chat and let me know. Otherwise, thank you guys very much for watching, for tuning in. If you're either with me live right now or if you're watching this as a video later on, I really do appreciate it. And yeah, thank you very much. Any more questions, just throw in the chat.